They say that only a true friend can protect you from your immortal enemies. But what if your so-called best friend was the reason for your death? Sadly, this concerning question became all too important in the friendship of Gwen Aguilar and Jane La Puebla. But what precisely happened between them? And what were the consequences of their heated disagreement? Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, folks. My name is Adrian, and welcome back to another video by Coffeehouse Crime. Today we're looking at the case of Jane La Puebla. Jane and Gwen were inseparable. They had very similar interests, were in the same profession, and shared very similar stresses and woes. So, what went so terribly wrong that it ended in murder? Today we're answering that question. Before we begin our case today, I'd like to welcome you back to one of Coffeehouse Crime's long-term sponsors, and that's NordVPN. NordVPN are currently hosting a cybersecurity awareness campaign, which, by the way, I think is a great idea, as in this day and age, it is absolutely vital for you to keep yourself safe on the internet. Now, picture this for just a moment, but you walk down to your local coffee shop, order yourself a cappuccino, and then sit down to relax. You pull out your phone and connect to the public Wi-Fi. Maybe it's called free coffee Wi-Fi. You've never seen this Wi-Fi before, but you've never been to this coffee shop before, so how do you know it's not their dedicated network? Unfortunately, it's not, and you've just allowed someone into all of your personal data. That free Wi-Fi network was actually set up by an impersonator who is now monitoring all of your phone activity, gathering your data, passwords, conversations, media, and more. This is known as a man-in-the-middle attack, and the consequences can vary from your personal data being leaked through to your bank accounts getting rinsed. This is one of the many reasons why NordVPN is the perfect tool to use. When you turn on a VPN, all of your browsing data will move along an encrypted tunnel between your device and a secure external server. Even if you connected to a hacker's hotspot, all they would see is encrypted gibberish. Encryption is a very effective tool designed to stop this sort of thing from happening. There are many more benefits to NordVPN too. For example, NordVPN also hides your IP address. This protects you from attacks which are targeted specifically towards you, which often come in the form of malware or distributed denial of service attacks. If you're interested, you can get the best deal with NordVPN by signing up through my link, nordvpn.com/coffeehousecrime. You'll get a massive discount on a 2-year plan with an additional 4 months for free. And by the way, it's also risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/coffeehousecrime for this very exclusive offer. Honestly, I use Nord every single day, and although I'd like to say it's a nice to have, it's basically essential these days. So thank you to NordVPN for keeping me safe, thank you to you guys for supporting us content creators, and now let's get straight back to today's video. Please pull up a seat and grab yourself a coffee. This is the case of Jane La Puebla. Another video, another new location. Today we find ourselves visiting the warm and beautiful region of Southeast Asia. More specifically, we're focusing on the Republic of Singapore, a small country just south of Malaysia. Now, Singapore is unique in many ways. It is comprised of one massive city, with several less populated islands scattered around the mainland. The city itself is incredibly vibrant and full of life, and personally speaking, here's something I love about it. Singapore has made a personal effort to be one of the greenest cities on the planet, and is constantly looking for ways to bring greenery into the busy lives of its citizens. For example, its Gardens by the Bay is a massive expanse of greenery consisting of 18 giant super trees, and many rooftop gardens and green skyscrapers are found throughout the city. Singapore consistently attempts to regreen its urban environment, which cleans its air and provides homes for hundreds of species of wildlife. The city can afford so much development with thanks to its vast amounts of wealth it has attained, which allows it to rank high in education, healthcare, technology, and of course, quality of life. And in fact, 1 in 6 households holds over $1 million in disposable income, and that's not even including property. The country is also seen as one of the safest in the world, and to add to this, has one of the lowest crime rates internationally, which kind of makes it ironic that it's now showing up on this channel. We'll get to that reason in just a minute. Although Singapore indeed sounds like an urban utopia, it does have one despairing problem. Although many of the mega-rich seem to live here, the country doesn't actually have a minimum wage, which unfortunately means that the Great Wealth Divide is amplified even further. This leaves many public sector and service workers susceptible to gross negligence, underpay and poverty. And sadly, this was the case for both women we are focusing on today. So please, allow me to introduce you to 29-year-old Gwen Aguilar and 26-year-old Jane La Puebla. The pair were Filipino migrants who had travelled to Singapore to find work, and quite similar to the case of Rick Jutting, the work they found was in domestic service. Much like Hong Kong, working for the rich will always be available in a city such as Singapore, and many of those jobs tend to be given to migrants who are willing to accept lower than average wages. Unfortunately, this is for one very simple reason: they are seen as easy to get cheap workers. Now, touching back on this topic once again, but a low wage in Singapore will actually pay much better than rural parts of Malaysia and the Philippines. This means that if you save 10% of your monthly earnings, that 10% will stretch much further back at home, and this is the main reason why many migrants move to Hong Kong or Singapore to find work. In an attempt to keep the family financially afloat, it was in the early 2000s that Gwen left her husband and children behind in the Philippines to find work in Singapore. She was eventually employed by a professional IT couple who were both in their 30s, and with work being so busy they were barely at home. As a result, she was hired as a live-in maid. This would be a similar case for Jane La Puebla. She came from central Luzon in the Philippines, and had left behind a husband and 9-year-old son in the process. Gwen and Jane had a very close relationship. Many said they were the best of friends, and were close enough to be described as almost like sisters. They were in the same profession, had similar stresses and woes, and held very similar interests. The two would often hang out together at the newly developed Lucky Plaza in the central of Singapore, where they would chat, drink, and eat. And every Sunday, the pair would walk around one of the many green parks in the city for a coffee and catch up. They would talk about various aspects of their lives, which included hobbies, work, and chat about the men that passed them by. You know how it is, just the usual stuff that girlfriends talk about in their 20s. Saying that, it wasn't always laughter and carefree chit-chat. The conversation often devolved into the primary stress in both of their lives, and of course, that was money. In fact, money was such a massive problem for the two of them that they regularly borrowed money from local loan sharks just to pay their debts and get by. That was until one day, Jane pushed her luck a little too far with these loan sharks, and as a result, she was permanently banned from using their services. Jane would continue to struggle after this. It's pretty obvious to say, but as a domestic worker, life is very tough in Singapore, and her financial situation only worsened. Just a reminder that 1 in 6 households have over $1 million of disposable income, which is a very stark contrast to Jane, who couldn't even afford to give herself food for the night. Now, Gwen didn't like seeing her friend in so much distress, so she made the decision to take out a loan in her own name to help Jane out. And you can probably see where this is going, but unfortunately, this was a grave mistake by Gwen, and it would have dire consequences. September the 9th, 2005. Today was just another typical morning, like any other in the modern city of Singapore. Workers were going about their everyday duties, professionals were catching the train, and domestic workers were heading to their family homes. This was no different for Maria Yi Maritam, a public service street cleaner performing her duties at Orchard Road MRT station in central Singapore. But at 1:45 PM that afternoon, Maria came across something very out of place. That was a lone bag lying by the side of a mosaic mural outside of one of the station's exits. Thinking that perhaps a traveller had accidentally left their bag behind, she decided to try and find the identity of the bag's owner. But after pulling back the zipper and opening the bag, she was horrifically greeted with the lifeless face of a young woman. Now, no one likes to find a dead body while at work, and Maria, she was both shocked and horrified. She, along with several others, notified the police immediately. Police officers eventually uncovered the decapitated head of a woman along with her severed arms and legs, but the torso was nowhere to be found. Curiously, there was a noticeable mark on her arm, and it appeared some time before her death she had been bitten. But who exactly she was and how she got there were entirely unknown. The bag containing her body had been left out in the open rather carelessly, so it was pretty obvious that whoever did this did not try to conceal the body. And with her killer leaving the hands intact, authorities were able to lift fingerprints. This of course came back with a conclusive match. The body belonged to Jane La Puebla. Since all migrants travelling into Singapore must provide fingerprints, iris and facial biometrics, it was very easy for authorities to identify her. But outside of Jane's identity, authorities had very little to work with. Of course, at this moment in time, the rogue teeth marks were unidentifiable and would only be able to be used as evidence if they already knew the killer. But the very next day on September the 10th, 2005, and before they had the opportunity to investigate any further, another daunting discovery was made, and this one gave police a glaring trail to follow. At 6 PM, a civil servant was on his way to a bus stop found just west of central Singapore at the MacRitchie Reservoir. And that was when, in the distance, he spotted a black duffel bag dumped outside of a building. The duffel bag was out of the ordinary, and after curiosity got the better of him, he decided to look what was inside. And upon opening the bag, he was met with the sight of a woman's torso. As you can probably guess, this was later identified to belong to Jane La Puebla. But Jane's killer had made one grave mistake this time. Her torso had been wrapped in copies of the Herald Tribune newspaper, and attached to one of its copies was a name and an address. The newspaper had been addressed to a man living in the city at Sunglade 9, Serangoon Avenue 2, and within 12 hours of finding this information, police descended on the condominium. Found in the heart of Singapore and comprising of several modern apartment complexes separated by multiple swimming pools, Sunglade can only be afforded by well-off professionals. After arriving at the marked apartment, authorities knocked on the front door, but the person to answer was not the homeowner. Instead, it was their live-in maid, Gwen Aguilar, and she seemed very unhappy to see officers. With both owners away at work, Gwen was the only one to have access to the apartment, and since authorities had already made a social connection between her and Jane, she was clearly in their spotlight, and therefore arrested on suspicion of her murder. After investigating the apartment, officers found a 10-inch cleaver wrapped in a red plastic bag, and no surprise, but this matched the same bag that Jane's head had been found in. So I guess you could say that Gwen was very good at her job, because the apartment was spotless. But although the apartment was clean to the naked eye, luminol expressed a very different story. For those curious, luminol is a purple agent that reacts to iron found in the blood, which therefore highlights trace amounts of blood that are otherwise invisible to the naked eye. With Gwen now in custody, she was surprisingly amicable with investigating officers, and although she cried upon her arrest, she was polite and understanding to police requests. And just 24 hours later, Gwen Aguilar confessed to murdering her best friend. Now, Gwen was very close to Jane, so the big question that posed to authorities was both why and how was she able to kill someone she described as her sister. To better understand this question, we must first rewind the clocks by 3 days, and that's back to the date of September the 7th. It was during this evening that both Gwen and Jane were relaxing in the Sunglade apartment. Gwen was cooking dinner for the two of them, and all appeared to be fine as the two ordinarily chatted away. However, as we already know, there were growing problems between the two women, and as time passed by, the pressure was mounting up. You see, the $2,000 loan that Gwen had taken out to help Jane had now grown with interest, and with this interest almost doubling the initial figure, neither of them actually had the money to pay it back. And so of course, when the two moved on to financial discussions, their conversation very quickly heated up. Now, according to Gwen, she suggested to Jane that she could pay back some of the debt she owed her by selling some of her expensive possessions, namely a digital camera. Jane grew agitated by this. She began to shout at Gwen, and the argument turned for the worse. And although it's not known who struck the first blow, things became physical between the two. The pair began to wrestle, and after pushing each other into walls and furniture, more aggressive actions such as hair pulling, biting, and strangling came into play. As the fight progressed, Jane's blood was smeared throughout the laundry room and hallway, and as the chaos spread into Gwen's bedroom, blood was spattered there too. Sadly, this ended in Gwen smothering Jane with a pillow, and although Jane eventually went limp, she wasn't actually dead yet. After Jane regained consciousness, Gwen jumped back on top of her and put her hands around her neck, and ultimately, this ended in Jane's untimely death. Back in the interrogation room, Gwen couldn't describe to officers why she went as far to kill her best friend. She couldn't recall her emotions during the murder. Only afterwards, she knew that she had to do something with her body. The homeowners were due back home later that very same evening, so she had to act swiftly. Taking her suitcase, she stuffed Jane's body inside and stashed it in a wardrobe in her bedroom. Gwen cleaned the crime scene, removing the most noticeable bloodstains across the house. Luckily, the homeowners never stayed for too long. They would be gone first thing in the morning, and they didn't seem to be aware of anything out of place either. All she had to do was conceal her secret until they left. 2 days later, on September the 9th, and after much thought and deliberation, Gwen travelled to Mustafa Shopping Centre to collect some cleaning supplies. While there, she bought a cleaver, an axe, black refuse bags, canvas gloves, latex gloves, bedding to replace the blood-stained sheets, and new green wallpaper, one that matched the current set in the apartment. And after returning to the apartment at approximately 9:30 PM, she dismembered Jane's body, cutting off all of her limbs with the cleaver and an axe before removing her head. These parts were wrapped in newspaper, which of course is what led officers to her front door. Gwen then hauled the bag containing Jane's head and limbs down 8 flights of stairs, caught a taxi to Orchard Road, and then dumped the bag in front of a mural, the same mural where both friends used to meet every Sunday. Returning to the flat, she collected the second bag containing Jane's torso and caught another taxi out to McRitchie Reservoir, where she nonchalantly placed the bag near a bus stop in front of the canteen. Both of these bags were placed in highly public places, and even now, Gwen can't explain her actions over those 4 days. The only certain thought and feeling was the immense remorse she felt for what she had done to her friend. But despite her feelings of guilt, and at the end of the day, a life was lost, and as a result, there was a judicial punishment to be had. For that reason, and no surprise, Gwen Aguilar was tried for the murder of Jane La Puebla. As part of pre-trial proceedings, Gwen was psychologically evaluated, and what psychologists found was a turbulent and troubled mind. Alongside Gwen's financial troubles and being away from her husband and children, her mental health had taken a big step in the wrong direction. To add to this, she had failed to save any money to send back home that month, which played on her mind greatly. Now, add Laura's debt to that problem, and you can see why she was in so much stress. Now, of course, this does not justify her actions, but it is important to see where that anxiety was coming from. Her most significant stress was money, and whenever she thought or talked about it, she would dissociate to the point where she would sleep all day. Professional psychiatrist Dr. Tommy Tan diagnosed her with masked depression, and in his opinion, her mind acted abnormally at the time of the offence, meaning she acted with diminished responsibility. To add to this was the fact that her altercation with Jane was a two-sided affair. It was noted that Gwen had already suffered multiple injuries and bruises across her body during her arrest. This even included strangulation marks around her neck. This fact, coupled with Gwen's psychiatric evaluation, persuaded the court to reduce her charge from murder to manslaughter. And this was lucky for Gwen, as the maximum penalty for murder in Singapore is the death penalty. Needless to say, but this decision may very well have spared her life. And in May of 2006, Gwen Aguilar's trial began. Her husband, Edwin Aguilar, came over from the Philippines to support her through the process, as even after her violent crimes, he still wanted to be with his wife. Jane's husband, Crisaldo La Puebla, was also in attendance, along with several other family members. And throughout the trial, Gwen frequently expressed remorse for her actions, stating she had no control over what she was doing at the time. In the end, she pled guilty to the manslaughter of Jane La Puebla, a plea which resulted in her being sentenced to 10 years in prison. The reasoning behind the judge's decision was that hopefully she could be fully rehabilitated through this time with the support of her family. During her sentencing, Judge Justice V.K. Raja stated, "Her decision to plant body parts in 2 very public places strikes one as incoherent and incomprehensible. It would be fair to infer that her prevailing illness was in all likelihood severely exacerbated after she killed the deceased." Although Gwen's sentence was reduced to manslaughter, the emotional gravity of her actions was no less than murder. She had taken the life of her best friend, a mother, and a wife. Jane was a young woman in a very similar boat to Gwen. She was trying to help her family, and unfortunately found herself in financial and emotional turmoil. Jane was both young and hopeful. She planned to eventually return to her family, leaving the problematic world of the service industry behind her. However, sadly, with all said and done, that will now never happen, and her life was cut short by the very person she confided everything in. Financial issues poisoned their friendship, and although both were to blame for their violence, all of this led to Jane's death. And now Gwen will have to live with her actions for the rest of her life. So I think that pretty much wraps up today's case, folks. A bit of a strange one, considering the nature of Jane's murder, but there's always room to argue that it was done in the heat of the moment. I guess for that reason, alongside the side of diminished responsibility, is precisely why she was charged with manslaughter instead of murder. As of the date of making this video, Gwen is now released and out in the public, and we don't actually know what she's doing or where she is now. To finish this story the same way we began, I found a famous quote by Oscar Wilde. "A good friend will always stab you in the front. and sadly, I guess this story supports that theory. Anyhow, thank you so much folks for watching another video today by Coffee House Crime. If you found this case interesting or you learned something new, then please remember to like the video and subscribe if you haven't yet. Thank you once again to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. If you would like to take advantage of my exclusive offer, then please visit nordvpn.com/coffeehousecrime. Now as always, I'll see you very soon for another video, but until that moment arrives, please remember to look after each other and stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.